Page 40, many halachot involved in this page. It looks like we're digressing from our subject, but we are not, since there are still several halachot in conjunction to Eruv. First subject is the idea of buying in hakafa on Shabbat. Hakafa meaning you're purchasing something from a non-Jew on Shabbat or festival with the condition that the payment will take place afterward. In what way and when and where you're allowed to do it. The next and the core issue we're going to discuss today is the issue of Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Chodesh, and holiday at large. Meaning, it was an ancient time, the Bet Din, the rabbinical court, were not sure about the exact day of the beginning of the month. They need to bring emissaries that testified in the court. Therefore, when it's come to Rosh Hashanah, beginning of the new year, it was a much serious question, since it's not just a beginning of a month, but it's also a key point of day of remembrance, day of judgment, prayer, etc. With that in mind, we're going to ask question in regards to the formulation of prayer on Rosh Hashanah. What we mention, what not. For example, since it's the beginning of the month of the shanim, of the years, what exactly we mention as a beginning, what statement we made, how many blessings we made. And then, time allow, if we reach a point that we have enough time, we'll go also to Tisha B'Av, Hilchot of Tisha B'Av. 6 lines from the top of the page 40. Hahu lifta de'at le'mechoza nafak rava chaze dechmisha shar ravel mizban bey. Shulchan Aruch Or HaChaim, Shin Kav Gimel, 323, said that we allowed to go ahead on Shabbat and Yom Tov and buying behakafa, which means buying with the condition that the payment will take place after. Now, the Mishnah Berurah added to that, and he said that that's the only condition you're allowed to purchase from a non-Jew. I remember, as an example, I have cousins that live in an old city in Jerusalem. There are several stores owned by non-Jews, and those stores are open on Shabbat. They made a certain agreement with them, so sometimes they have a family kiddush, simchas, life cycle events that are taking place on Shabbat. Remember, they used to go there and pick up, and after Shabbat they paid for that. But so here we talk about a delivery of a lifta, which is a turnip. So it was brought to a place called Mechuza by a non-Jew. So Rava, which is the posek, the one who rules, he looked at that turnip and he noticed that it's in the beginning of process of being dry, right? So the Rava said, okay, if that's the case, you can go ahead and purchase it from a non-Jew. And he explained, and he said, Amar havadai me'etmol ne'ekra. So Tosfot here explains that we have here two different entities. One is the idea of muktzeh, which means if this turnip was designated in advance, then you're allowed to go ahead and use it. But because it was not set aside in advance, Tosfot explains that therefore it's muktzeh and you cannot use it. What is the other phase, the common mistake? They may think that if this turnip was cutting up on Yom Tov, so for sure it's called tlisha, which means cutting, and that biblical prohibition. But remember that here, when the non-Jew appeared, he came there after he did this process of cutting for another non-Jew. So it's important to remember that if a non-Jew did a work for another non-Jew, we have no problem to go ahead and use it. The only issue here, it was because Tosfot explained it was not set aside in advance, therefore we cannot use it. But here he said, Vadai me'etmol ne'ekra, it's clear that yesterday it was taken. So if it taken yesterday, Mai amart michutz latchum atya, what might you say that they came from outside of Shabbat limit? And so if or Yom Tov limit, right? So you may said that it's since it come there, so it should be therefore prohibited. So he said, "Ba bishvil Israel ze mutar lechol Israel acher." So he said that if it's come from a fellow Jew, so it's permitted to eat by another Jew. Meaning, even the other Jew, it wasn't brought for him. V'kol sheken hai dedat al nochinata. But here for sure, since it was made because he, meaning the non-Jew, brought it for other Jews. So it's important to remember, we study in the Tractate Shabbat 151, if a non-Jew brought some, for example, produce, and it's a city that mainly occupied by non-Jew, so we go by the idea that if you bringing something to a place that the majority were, for example, non-Jews, we judge this as a non-Jewish city. So if it was brought to a non-Jewish city, a fellow Jew that lived there can go ahead and purchase it. It's called the da'ata de nochrim ata, which came with the idea of selling to a non-Jew for the sake, rather than for the sake of the Jewish people. So therefore, if they are purchased by Jews, no prohibited is violated. Why? Kevan de chachaza de kamapshi umaite lehu asar lehu. But Rava saw that what they do, these non-Jew merchants, they bring a quantity of this turnip on festival days. Why? Because they realize that the Jewish customers buying it. So he said, if that's the case, he forbid them, and he said that he cannot use it, because this was evident that they were being brought for the Jews. Hahu bnei gnana. Now, if you remember, not long ago, during the festival of Passover, they asked me a question about a non-Jew that did some work here for us. And it was a question because it's a professional work that made at the last day of Yom Tov, which is the day that's celebrated in diaspora. And if you remember, I said no, but here it's a discussion over that. What's the source of the whole idea of making the last day of Yom Tov in a level of a regular other days, or making the second day of Yom Tov the same? So we bring an example, Ahu bnei gnana. Gnana, in those days, they used to make a canopy in a certain way. It was professional people that made the canopy, and they made it in such a way that they use martles for a good smell. If you go to a Sephardic synagogue on Friday night, they see people giving you a martle to smell and make a bracha, right? Mm-hmm. So there is it was a minhag to make the chuppah, the canopy, in such a way. So it was a professional people. It's called bnei genana. That was their field. The gazul asa biyom tov shel sheni. As you know, outside of Eretz Israel in diaspora, we're celebrating 2 days of each festival. So the reason originally it's because they wasn't sure. It was they take time to announce when it's the so le'uta in the eve of the festival, meaning right after the festival. Shara le'urevin le'uruche bele'alta. Usually there is a concept called bichdei sheyasu, which means you need to wait a certain period of time. For example, remember we discussed on Shabbat
the baths.
The bath houses.
Right, the bathhouses.
So
right.
you have to wait a certain time until they heated, so you know it
You have to
wasn't.
give them enough time that the water could have been heated after Shabbat.
Excellent.
Right.
So it's called bichdei sheyasu. You
Even
have to
though
wait.
they heated it before. Right?
So here, Ravina allowed them. Why allow them? So, since the non-Jew cut this myrtle for the Jews, so you cannot use them on the festival because it's called kotzer, meaning that one of the labor forbidden. Now, the rabbis came in and said, if the non-Jew did something and you want to use it, you have to wait a certain period of time after the festival in order to derive joy from that. So if it was on Shabbat or on a festival the first day, even Ravina forbids it. But here, Ravina hold that in the second day in the diaspora, for example, if you talk a day that we did here in Passover, the Giskor, which was the last of the last days, meaning the second day of the diaspora, it was a different period of time. It was a time that they made decision according to the witnesses. The witnesses came to Bet Din and they make decision accordingly. But then things change and they start setting a time for the festival. It's like we have now, we have Zmanim. You go to those sites and you know clearly what is there. You click on your iPad, you know what is the the time of the festival. So since it changed, in one hand the rabbis want to keep the way that it was, to keep the respect and people not belittle and make these 2 days the way that they have the tradition from the ancestors. That's the famous Gemara in Tractate Beya, page 4. But because they know clearly that the holiday was in the first day, for example, let's talk in a sense of festival of Passover. We just passed Passover. So in Eretz Israel, the last day, they combine, correct? They have the two together. Here we have 2 separate days, which means which day is more important? If you think about it, the day that everybody in Eretz Israel and here, that's the day it should be. So therefore, here in that case, he came out and Ravina said, okay, I allow you to go ahead and use this myrtle and smell them, because he holds that his leniency can take place since the non-Jew cut it at that time. And therefore, he doesn't hold the same category of leniency, the same as the other festival. אמר לי רבא בר תחליפא לרבינה, ליסר לאומר מפני שאינם בני תורה. Excellent. I don't know if you guys remember, but in so many cases, you rabbi said you can't do it, and when the people ask me in private, how come? And my answer is, since you have many times the situation that people who doesn't have the knowledge of Torah, and since they don't have in their ignorance, they might come to treat certain law lightly.
Like kidney or two.
So unless you have extra restrictions, so you put these boundaries. So otherwise they belittle a lot of things that because they're not familiar with. So that was the story. You say it's Nabne Torah, so these people, at least you should wait b'chdei sheyasu, you wait a little period of time. So otherwise people in that place they can belittle all of that. Matkif la Rav Shmaya, he heard that, Rav Shmaya heard that, and he asked, Tamad de einan bnei Torah. The reason that we want to forbid this smell of the myrtles, was because those people, Bnei Genana, the people who made those canopies, were not Torah people. Okay? Ha Bnei Torah Sharei, quite the contrary. If there are people who have the knowledge of Torah, so you can go and use them, use this model at the right after Yom Tov. Veha be'inan bichdei sheyasu. We require them to wait the time needed for the marvel's preparation. So, meaning everyone. Azal shi'aulu al Rabba. So he went and he asked the Rabba that question. Amar lahem bichdei sheyasu. Yes, we require them to wait the time needed for the model preparations. Which means that Rava hold the same as Ravina, that the whole idea of the second day in diaspora is because it was the minhag, the tradition of their ancestors, and therefore we hold much more leniency versus the first one. However, in order not for people to belittle that, and they said that it's not important that you see some other movements that they have this notion, so he hold that we have to wait bichdei sheyasu. Now, what is the bichdei sheyasu? What is the really idea of time of models preparations? So Tosfot tells us in the previous page in the 39b, he said that apply only to the time of cutting these models, but not the time frame of going there, preparing the materials and then cutting them and bringing it. That's not. But not everyone goes like that. The Shulchan Aruch Or HaChaim Taf Kuf Tet Vav, the Shulchan Aruch Or HaChaim hold that no, that it has to be b'chdei sheyasu for the whole process, which much more time for the non-Jew to prepare all the materials and go there and cut it and bring it, which is much longer. Mishnah. רבי דוסה אומר עובר לפני התיבה ביום טוב של ראש השנה אומר אך לצלו שמלכים את יום החודש הזה עם היום עם המחר ולמחר אומר עם היום עם אמש. So the Mishnah said that Rabbi Dosa said the version on Rosh Hashanah prayer. He who passed before the ark and lead the congregation prayer the first day of the festival of Rosh Hashanah, he asked Hashem, strengthen our Lord, our God, on the day of the new moon, whether it's today or tomorrow. Why we said it? Because remember we have a discussion in the Mishnah. We're not so sure when is the proper day, and therefore, because it was safek, so they said if it's this day or it's the other. It said Amar Rabba ki avinan be Ravuna. When I was in the yeshiva of Ravuna, Ibailan, we have this question. Should we mention the beginning of the new moon in Rosh Hashanah? Remember, there are 4 different Rosh Hashanah, and one of them is the Rosh Hashanah for the sabbatical and jubilee years, vegetations, which is the beginning of Tishrei. Since this is one of the Rosh Hashanah, so it's an entity, new entity, it's called Rosh Hashanah. On the other hand, it's also Rosh Chodesh, it's the beginning of the month of Tishrei. Mm-hmm. So you ask a question, should we mention the same as we said in Ata Bechartanu, Vatiten Lanu, that God gave us, et Yom Rosh HaChodesh Hazeh v'et Yom HaZikaron Hazeh. That He gave us, today is the day of beginning of the month of Tishrei, and Remembrance Day. So he said, what's the question? Keivan dachalukin bemusafin. Because on Rosh Hashanah they're bringing 2 additional offerings, the offering of Rosh Hashanah and the offering of Rosh Chodesh. How do you know? Because the Torah said in Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers, chapter 29, Milvad Olat HaChodesh. That's not included the offering of the Rosh Chodesh, which means that you have 2 separate additional offerings, one for Rosh Hashanah and one for Rosh Chodesh. Amrinan. So therefore we should say, mention Rosh Chodesh with Rosh Hashanah. Or Dilma, or you maybe go the other way around and you said, Zikaron Echad Ole Lekan Velekan. Tosfot explains, since we said Et Yom HaZikarona, this is the day of remembrance, so therefore it's applied to both. When he mentioned this day of remembrance, it's included Rosh Chodesh. Amar Lan, Rav Huna said Tenitua. This din, this law, we learn in the Mishnah. Rabbi Dosa Omer Over Lifnei HaTeva. Rabbi Dosa said that one who go and lead the congregation, if it's the day of Rosh Hashanah, he should say Hachlitzenu. But the rabbis didn't disagree with him. We don't see us doing that, right? My love, what does that mean that the rabbis follow Rabbi Dosa? Leazkir. You mean to say that you should mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah? So he said, Lo, leatnot. That's apply only to put the stipulation, the condition in a prayer, which means that since, remember, this is the time that they're not sure what is the proper day of Rosh Hashanah. So since they're not sure, they put the condition. If it's today, today. If it's tomorrow, etc. So that's they apply it to the t'nai, the language of conditional. Hachename mistabra. That's the way we understand that according to the sages, the reason we mentioned Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah, it's because of that, and not because we are in debate if it's today or tomorrow Rosh Hashanah. מדקטנה בברייתא, because we learn in the ברייתא, וכן היה רבי דוסה עושה בראשי חודשים של כל השנה כולה. So any Rosh Chodesh that it was a question, and he was in a predicament, he wasn't sure what day, so those people who live far away from the Bet Din, if the Bet Din make the date that is the 30 or the 31st from the previous month, so since that he used to have this phrase of Achlitzenu, since it wasn't clear which one it is. Velo dulo, but the sages disagree with him. If you tell me that they put a conditional in the line, so we understand why they disagree. Because they said every Rosh Chodesh we don't put this condition. We just make that prayer and we have the assumption that that's the proper day. But if you mention that doing the prayer of Rosh Hashanah you should mention Rosh Chodesh, why the sages do not agree with him? So they said, Ve'ela mai lehatnot. What do you tell me that the disputation between Rabbi Dosa and the sages, if it's the idea of putting a condition in his prayer, and you should say, if today is Rosh Chodesh, if not, lama le'lafluge beitarti. Why they did not have this twice, the same machlok, the same disputation, which means one time we have in the Mishnah in regard to Rosh Hashanah, and the other one is in regard to all the other 11 months. So the Gemara said, Tzricha. We need to have both. Diyash minan Rosh Hashanah, that if we have that disputation in regards to the prayer of Rosh Hashanah only, Hava mina, what you may think, Beha kamre Rabbanan delo, that specifically in Rosh Hashanah the sages said that you should not mention this condition in your prayer, Mishum de'at elezalzulei bei, because if you imagine that the audience, the people who are not so educated, they hear that you are not sure about it, you are not assert if it's this day or that day. What happened in leadership when you are leading and people feel that you are not certain about, you are vacillate, you are not decisive. So people, they start belittling you, belittling what you're saying. Why? Because they feel that you are not clear, right? The same here, since you said, if today is Rosh Hashanah, if today is Rosh Chodesh, if not, then accept the prayer tomorrow. People will not take it seriously. They light-hearted over that. אבל בראשי חודשים של כל השנה כולה הם המודל לרבי דוסה. But this, okay, now we should differentiate between Rosh Hashanah and the rest. Because if you talk about the other, all the beginning of the month of the entire year, so we said, since it's a Safek Rosh Chodesh, since we're not clear if it is Rosh Chodesh or not, so therefore, they should go ahead and agree with Rabbi Dosa that they should make those conditions. Ve'it marbeha. But if this disputation between Rabbi Dosa and the sages apply only to what? To all the other months, but not in Rosh Hashanah be'akama Rabbi Dosa, that only when you have a doubt, when it's Rosh Chodesh, so that's applied to all the 11 months. But if in Rosh Hashanah, Eima modei lehu lerabanan, you may say that Rabbi Dosa agree with the sages. So what to agree with the sages? That due to the concern, lest people will come to treat the festival lightly. So they said, therefore, tzricha. So we have to have the necessary to state the disagreement in both cases. So what we derive from that? That according to Rabbi Dosa, we mentioned on Rosh Chodesh in a condition, but we don't have clarity in regards to Rosh Hashanah yet. So there are those who say that Rabbi Dosa hold that time should say et Yom HaZikaron hazeh, these remember days, im hayom im o machar, if it's today or tomorrow. Why? Again, in order not to belittle the sanctity of Rosh Hashanah. That's the Gaon Yaakov and Keren Orah said it. Now, before we go further, on Rosh Hashanah we have 9 blessings doing the additional prayer, doing the Musaf.
Musaf Amida.
Musaf Amida. We have number 1, we have the Avot. Baruch Ata Hashem, Elokeinu Elokei Avotenu Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Magen Avraham. Number 1. Then Gvurot. Ata Gibor Olam Hashem, Mechayeh Metim, etc., etc., Mechayeh Metim. Then we have Kedusha Hashem, Baruch Ata Hashem, Akel HaKadosh. Then we have Malchuyot, which is the kingdom, together with the day of Rosh Hashanah. Today. Then we have Zichronot, remembrance. Then we have Shofarot, the last part, Atani Gleita. Okay? We have then Modim, the Avodat Bet HaMikdash. We have Hoda'ah, when we bow down and complete the Modim. So the first one is Retzeh, and then we have Modim. And then we have the Birkat Kohanim and Sim Shalom. So altogether we have 9. That's the 9 of Musaf. Meitivei Rosh Hashanah shechal liot b'Shabbat. How do we treat Rosh Hashanah that occurred on Shabbat? Beit Shammai אומרים מתפלל 10. Beit Shammai said you have to have 10 blessings, which is what? 9 of Musaf plus addition 1 for Shabbat, which means Beit Shammai said that for every event you need to add a separate blessing. Now, ובית הלל אומרים מתפלל 9. Beit Hillel said that you make all these regular 9 blessing of Rosh Hashanah and you incorporate within the 9 a separate blessing for Shabbat. Which is, the core point is, Beit Hillel said you don't need to add a separate blessing for each event. It's all together in one. Ve'im ita. Now go back. You remember that the sages have an issue with Rabbi Dosa, that you need to mention Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah. Ve'im ita Beit Shammai 11 מבעלי. If you go that way, so Beit Shammai basically need 11, because you're not sure. You're not sure. They must decide 11 blessings, 9 for Rosh Hashanah, 1 for Shabbat, and 1 for Rosh Chodesh. So we just turned to 40b. אמר רבי זרע, שאני ראש חודש מתוך שכולל שחרית וערבית, כולל נעמי מוספים. ראש חודש is different, since we incorporate in the evening prayer and the morning prayer, the additional prayer, so it's also applied to the Musaf, to the additional. But other festivals that occurred on Shabbat, that you have independent prayer for in the evening, morning, and the afternoon. So therefore, you make a separate blessing also in the Musaf. But it means that according to Beit Shammai, you can mention Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month on Rosh Hashanah, but you don't make it as a separate bracha, independent. So therefore, if Rosh Hashanah occurred on Shabbat, you make 10 and not 11 blessings. So they ask, Umi itlu lebeit Shammai kolel. So do you tell me that Beit Shammai meant that you incorporate the Rosh Chodesh within the blessings of the Musaf? Ve'atane Rosh Chodesh chalil b'Shabbat. We learn in the Braita, if Rosh Chodesh occurred on Shabbat, Beit Shammai will mitpalel 8, Beit Hillel mitpalel 7. Beit Shammai said you have the 7 blessing of Musaf plus a separate blessing for Rosh Chodesh. And Beit Hillel said no, you make it 7 and you incorporate part of that Rosh Chodesh. Kasha. So it means that the question here is no resolution. So some Rishonim say that it's not full refutations. It's like tuvta, so meaning at that moment they don't have a resolution.
So in this case, you don't automatically go with Beit Hillel?
The question is, according to the student of Rav Huna, that hold the same as the sages who disagree with Rabbi Dosa, we mentioned Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. That's the key issue here. Because remember, Rabbi Dosa have a whole point of saying this as a conditional, as a stipulation, that if v'cholel atzmo, which means that you incorporate Rosh Chodesh in Shabbat, Tanai, it's a disputation between the Tanaim, the Tanya. Shabbat shechalot b'Rosh Chodesh or b'cholo shel moed, if Shabbat occurred on Rosh Chodesh or during the intermediate day of the festival. So you know that during Chol HaMoed we have a Shacharit, Mincha and Arvit, and then we have the same as a regular week, but we add a special Musaf for Yom Tov. The same as we have Rosh Chodesh, and we mentioned doing that Me'ena Me'ora, something related to the event. The same as we do in a regular Shabbat, when it's occurred with Rosh Chodesh. So he said, Arvit, Shachrit, Mincha, Mitpel Kedarko, Sheva, Vomer Me'ena Me'ora, we mentioned something related to that event. For example, Ya'aleh V'yavo, that mentioned the Rosh Chodesh or the festival, Ba'avodah, doing the Retzeh, because why it's Retzeh? Retzeh we talk about please God, return the work on the Beit HaMikdash. So you mentioned that, you mentioned also Ya'aleh V'yavo. It's like asking Hashem to have compassion and to return the service, like the Rashi said in Shabbat 24. But he said, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Be'oda'a, he mentioned that doing Modim, it's like he mentioned Chanukah and Purim, Al Anisim, you should make also Hoda'ah in regard to Me'ena Me'ora, whatever it's there, Ve'im lo amar, machzirim oto. But if he forgot, you should ask him to go back and return. Sometimes you need to return the beginning of the prayer, sometimes you need to begin at the beginning of the bracha. That's the Or HaChaim Tav Tzadik. If he remind himself for in a few seconds, Shalom Alecha Rabbi Umori, in a few seconds, so you go to the beginning of the blessing. If not, then if it's too late, you have to go to the beginning of the Amidah. Ube Musafin, doing the additional prayer, the Musaf, מתחיל בשל שבת, ומסיים בשל שבת, ואומר קדושת היום באמצע, beginning of Shabbat, and on Shabbat, and in between, he mentioned Rosh Chodesh, which means you don't add it as a separate entity, so you incorporate it. רבן שמעון גמליאל, רבי ישמעאל בנו רבי יוחנן בן ברוקה אומרים, כל מקום שזקוק לשבע, anytime you need to have 7 blessings, meaning not only in Musaf, but also in Ma'ariv, in Shachrit and Mincha, on Shabbat, מתחיל בשל שבת, the beginning of the middle bracha of Shabbat, ומסיים בשל שבת, you complete it with Shabbat, ואומר קדושת היום באמצע, you mention Rosh Chodesh and a festival in the middle, which means that this is the Tanaic disputation if you incorporate Rosh Chodesh in the bracha of Shabbat, excluding Musaf, according to Rabban Shimon Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon Nosh Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, you incorporate Rosh Chodesh within the blessing of the day, and all the prayer. According to Tanakam and Rabbi Eliezer, in Ma'ariv, Shacharit and Mincha, you not incorporate Rosh Chodesh. It's a part of blessing of the Shabbat. Rashi here said in the Bur Matchil Pasak that the final halacha, all the prayer excluding Musaf, you mention Rosh Chodesh in the Avodah, which is Ya'aleh v'Yavo, doing the Avodah. Maya ve'ala. So what's the final halacha? Rav Chizda said you do not mention the Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah. Why? Zikaron echad ole lo lekan velekan, which is when you mention it Yom HaZikaron hazeh, that's included Rosh Chodesh, because Rosh Hashanah it's always also Rosh Chodesh. V'chen amar Rabba Zikaron echad ole lo lekan velekan. So now you see why you don't mention Ya'aleh v'Yavo during Rosh Hashanah. Another question. ואמר רבא, כי אבינה ברב הונא, when I study in yeshiva in Rav Huna Ibalan, מהו לומר זמן בראש השנה ויום כיפור? Should we say the ברכה שהחיינו מזמן on ראש השנה and יום כיפור? So what's the dilemma? כיוון דמזמן לזמן עתי, because you don't have it all the time, it just happen sometimes. So, או דילמה אמרינן. So therefore we said ברכה ושהחיינו. דילמה כיוון דלא יקרו רגלים. Because Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is not considering a festival like others. לא אמרינן. So we don't say שהחיינו. Because remember, Pesach, Shavuot and Sukkot, it's called festival, it's called regel. You go to the Beit HaMikdash, etc. Aliyah l'regel.
Pilgrimage festivals.
Pilgrimage.
Yep.
So it's a mitzvah to go to the Beit HaMikdash, to l'ra'ot, to see them in the Mikdash, etc. Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, it's important days, but it's not. You don't have the mitzvah of Aliyah l'regel to go to do pilgrimage. So lo ave biyadei. He doesn't reconcile the question. Ki atei Rav Yehuda, when he came before Rav Yehuda, Amar Ana Akra Chadeta Name Amrinan Zman. He says, when I see a new gourd, what is it? Dlat? What is it?
Is it like a gourd or a squash?
Squash.
Yeah,
Squash
is fine too. Yeah,
right?
they're very.
So when I see a new squash, which every year it's a new one, I made a separate bracha, because each year it's a new one. So when you eat the new fruits, you make a bracha. Therefore, I hold that for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur I should make Shehecheyanu. Why? Because it's only once. So even you don't have a special joy and gladness when you eat a squash every year, but when it's once a while, and you must probably like it very much, you make that. So אמר לי, רשות לא כמיבא אלי, כי כמיבא אלי חובה. Here is the idea. You have an optional and you have a requirement. So for example, squash, it's an optional, because it's not all the time, versus when you have a certain festival that occurred in certain time, for example the 3 festivals, so that's obligatory, it's chovah. So here the big question is, since Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur it's also considering a Yom Tov, right, a joyous festival, joyous days, so is that obligatory to mention the Zman or not? Meaning you should make this a separate blessing or not? So he said, the big question is, can I say Shehecheyanu on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? If you see in the practical halacha, we do say Shehecheyanu, right?
We say it over the new, but we also have new fruit that we have midnight to eat new fruit, right, as well. So
yeah, but Yom Kippur, you said Shehecheyanu right after Kol Nidre, right?
Right.
My, what's the din? Amar li, Rav Yehuda respond, Rav Shmuel, the Amret Ravayu, Rav Shmuel, they both said, En omer zman ela b'shalosh regalim. They said only you should mention in the 3 festivals, but not Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Meitivei. There is a sentence that King Solomon said in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 11, Ten chelek leshiv'a v'gam leshmona. This pasuk dealing with the mitzvah of tzedakah. So they said you have to give a portion to the indigent. So you take from your bread to 7 poor people, and then another portion to the 8th person later, or the 8 poor people later. And he says you should not say, oh, I gave enough tzedakah, I gave enough to poor people, because ki lo teda ma yeh ra'a la'aretz. You don't know, we explained many times that the life cycle can go ups and downs, and therefore you don't know what's happened tomorrow. So in a sense, the more you give tzedakah, the more protection against poverty or bankruptcy or things like that. So Rabbi Eliezer derived from that line, Shiv'a elu shiv'a yemei bereshit. So we said that take a portion, it's applied to the 7 days of creation, which means that Hashem, the Almighty, chooses 1 day out of 7 to be the day of rest, which is the Shabbat. That's Hashem's portion. Shmona, Eilu Shmona Yemei Milah, which means, in a sense, in our language, it's the portion of God, which is the 8th day, the time that we do the Brit Milah, the covenant. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, Shiv'a, what King Solomon meant when he used the number 7, Eilu Shiv'a Yemei Pesach. Because according to the Torah, festival of Passover, it's 7 days. Outside of Eretz Israel, the diaspora, and do 8. Because of the witnesses and everything. But according to the Torah, it's 7 days. Shmona elo shmona yemei chag. When you use the 8, it's applied to Chag. Usually they use the term Chag. It's applied to Sukkot. Ukshehu omer vegam, and he uses the word in addition, lerabot atzeret v'Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippur. So the pasuk can said chelek leshiva v'shmona, and that's it. Why need the word vegam? It's an addition. So the vegam come to tell us that that's applied to the festival of Shavuot and Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, that it's also in our language Hashem has a portion of those festivals. My lizman, my love lizman, which means the Rabbi Shua applied to the obligation in regard to the zman. Zman meaning that that's portion of God. So this sentence want to remind us that we need to make a Birkat Shechianu in all of those festivals, including Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. We learned it earlier, not the opposite of Rav and Shmuel. Said Lo li bracha, which means that you have to make a separate blessing. Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Yisrael ve'hazmanim. And Rosh Hashanah you said Mekadesh Yisrael ve'yom hazikaron. On Yom Kippur you said Mekadesh Yisrael v'Yom HaKippurim. Hachenami mistabra. That's what we understand what Rabbi Yeshua applied to the blessing of that specific event that day. The isal kadatach lizman, that if you tell me that what Rabbi Yeshua applies is to Shechiyanu zman kol shiv'a mi'ika. Do you say Shechiyanu to all the 7 days of Passover? Shechiyanu always say 1 time when you have the beginning of the festival. So I have to say that Rabbi Yoshua apply to a special bracha that you made that day. So it said v'halo kashya, that the question we ask, it's not the question why. Di'ilo mevarech ha'idna mevarech lemachar ve'uliyom ochara. That if he doesn't make the bracha of Shechiyanu the first day of the festival, so you can make it the following day or another day of the festival, because they are all considering part of the Shechiyanu. So now he asks, Mikol Makom Be'inan Kos, the bracha of Shechianu, you need to have a cup. So usually after the first day of the festival, most of the people doesn't have a wine. So how they make Shechianu the rest of the days? למה מסייע לו לרב נחמן? אמר רב נחמן, זמן אומרו אפילו בשוק. Which means you have to mention the zman, the time, even in any, you are in a market, which means that the bracha of Shechianu, he doesn't need to have a cup to say the blessing while you're holding the cup. Which means, according to Rav Nachman, if you don't say the blessing of Shechianu on the first day, you can make it all the rest of the days, even you don't have wine. So the Gemara rejected, and they said, no, you have to say that Shechianu, you need to have a cup. Why? Ha lo kasha de ikla leikos. It's not a question that you have somehow a cup. Ha tinach atzeret v'rosh Hashanah b'yom kippur echayavid. In regards to the Shechianu, I understand that that's applied to Shavuot and Rosh Hashanah, that you need to have a cup, but how you make in Yom Kippurim Shechianu? You don't have a cup of wine. So how you make Shechianu? So he said, if you make the bracha Shechianu over the cup of wine, and you drink the wine in advance before the beginning of the Day of Atonement, so the minutes he mentioned that he is basically put in addition to the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, which means, according to the Torah, you can start the fast on Yom Kippur earlier. But the moment you accept upon yourself the fast, so you are there. So let's say if the fast begins at 7 and you decide at 4 o'clock that you begin your fast, that's it. You cannot change your mind. You are already in the domain of fasting from that moment. Deha amar lei Rav Yirmiyah bar Rabba leRav. So one time it was Friday afternoon, and it was a dark, and Rav made the evening prayer of Shabbat before it was dark. So Rav Yirmiyah bar Rabba said to him, Mi badalt? You stop doing any type of work now? Even later on, it turned that the cloud moved and it was during the day. So imagine if it was like before the Zmanim, let's say 3 o'clock on Friday, he already made the prayer of the Mariv, and then all of a sudden he realized what? He realized that it's day, it's not night yet. The clouds move. Amar lei ein badilna. Already made up accepting Shabbat earlier, and even the cloud change already stopped from doing type of work. So it means that when it's come to Shechianu, you accept in Yom Kippur even before it's time, and therefore you cannot drink wine, etc. So they said livrech alei velanchei. So maybe you make the bracha on the cup before the fast and then leave it. Why? He says he cannot do it. Why? Amvarech tzarich shitom. That's so important that one who make the bracha, he need to drink from what he make the bracha. Leit ve'leyenuka. So maybe he should drink, he should make the bracha. It's not necessarily the one who make the bracha, but maybe a little boy that is not bar mitzvah yet, so he can drink it. Like if you pay attention on the kiddush here on Friday night, we're doing that. We let the little boy below than bar mitzvah to drink it. He said late hilchet Rav Acha. The halacha is not according to Rav Acha that allow the mature adult to give the minor, meaning they give someone who below than bar mitzvah to do something that it's forbidden for himself. For example, that the one who make the blessing give the little boy to drink the wine in Yom Kippur, even he himself already accept Yom Kippur. So trace the situation. Yom Kippur start at 7. He make this bracha of Shechianu over the cup, and he accepted upon himself Yom Kippur at 6 o'clock. And now we let a boy that is not bar mitzvah drinking from it. So he said, Dilma atele misrach. So it's not good. You know why? Because you're training this little boy over something that when he grew up, he's going to drink on Yom Kippur. So therefore, Mayave alai. What's the practical halacha? should we make the Shechianu on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur or not? Shadrua Rabbanan. Basic idea is that the conclusion is that you cannot make a bracha of the Shechianu over the wine on Yom Kippur. Either because you need the cup, or because that you're basically accepting upon yourself by doing so, and you cannot give it to a little boy to drink it because you're training him wrongly. The sages sent Rav Yema before Rav Chizda on the eve of Rosh Hashanah. Amrulei, sages said to Rav Yema Saba, look how our leader Rav Chizda does when it's come to Shechianu on Rosh Hashanah. Ta'i Marlan, come and tell us. Ki Chazye, when Rav Chizda saw that Rav Yema Saba came, he was so smart, he understood that he's coming there to check him out how he make the Shechianu Rosh Hashanah. Amar lei dalyua lertiva raf salei beduchta. Rav Chizda and Rashi here use the word klomar. המגביע עץ לך שאינו ראוי להישג בידוע שצריך למקומו הועיל ואליו ואינו צריך שעל חינם לא יגביעו, כלומר על חינם לא באת לכאן. So I explained in my book, ביאורי כלומר ברש"י על הש"ס, that it's a mashal and imshal, that he wanted to use an example. So he noticed them that they came here. So he said to them, you know, it's like the word of folk saying, one who picks up moist log which is not fit for firewood must want to do something on the spot. In other words, you certainly have come to me with some purpose in mind, and not just to see my beautiful face, right? So you come here to see what I do in Shechianu, right? I to lay kasa de chamra. So they brought before Chizda cup of wine. Kaddish ve'amar zman. So he recited the Kiddush and make the blessing of the time, which is the Shechianu. So it means that the Gemara did not ask a question in regard to Shechianu Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. That for sure you can make the blessings the same as you make a blessing for squash. The only question is if it's obligatory on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Vehilcheta, and the practical halacha. אומר זמן בראש השונה יום כיפור והלכת הזמן אומרו אפילו בשוק. So it means that you can make the time Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur and you recite the blessing for time even in the market. That you don't need a cup of wine to do it. You notice before Ma'ariv on Yom Kippur we make it in a synagogue Shechianu without the cup. And the other festivals we use a cup. So basically we'll go by the way that Rav Chizda did, and the halacha is according to Rav Nachman that said that even without the cup, meaning any place, in the market, any place you can make that bracha. Shulchan Aruch Or HaChaim 5:15. The person for whom a non-Jew brought an object from outside the Shabbat limit is prohibited to utilize the object until the first festival day has concluded and the time required to bring a similar object from outside the limit has elapsed, and that's bichdei sheyasu. An object brought by a non-Jew from outside the limit for a specific Jew is permitted to be utilized by other Jews. We also explained the concept of certain halachot she'enam bnei Torah, the people who are not really learned people, and we mentioned that in Rosh Hashanah we make teisha brachot, 9 blessings, and we have a discussion over Shechianu. One must recite the blessing of the time who is giving us life on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, one does not recite over a cup of wine because it's concern raised by the Gemara, and therefore we don't make the the cup of wine Yom Kippur, but as you remember, we said that it can be recited anywhere, and that's Shulchan Aruch Harachaim 6:19.